Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we're going to explore the diverse and tragic story of Germans who resisted the Nazi regime. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. This time, perhaps to a degree, a somewhat slightly different subject, you might say, because this is not only, let's call it, hardcore military history of World War II, but we're looking a little bit around the edges as well at other things, the resistance, which of course has a military wing or angle to it, and we'll get to it later on. But of course, there are also lots of other factions, lots of other groups. But I think it's really important that we cover this as well. So not only concentrating on the military one, but let's look at what else happened in Germany. We did have a question on this from one of our listeners, so we thought that we should turn this probably into a slightly bigger piece because it is broad, it is very, very wide. We'll see whether we can do it justice now here in a podcast. See how many we need on this, whether we can do it in one. Do we need 2? Do we need 5? Do we need 10? It is a very, very broad subject. So let's see where we go with this. So Jesse, over to you.
Right. Well, military history is not just about the pointy end, of course. War, as I've mentioned probably several times now on the podcast, war is politics by other means. And so politics and the social aspect of that is also a part of what war is, what it does, and what's important to talk about. So Eric, one of our supporters, asked us to talk a bit about German resistance. And if you out there, just before we get into that, if you listeners out there are interested in asking us a question, hopefully we'll get to it. We'll do our best in any case. You can also become a supporter of the podcast by going to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. There we also have extra content that is not on the public episodes. That place is called the War Room, and you can get a free trial if you want to test it out for a month for free before you decide to commit. You can do that for free by using the code DEEPDARKWOODS. So, that being said, our supporter Eric, interested in German resistance, it's a topic that's a little bit scattered. It's a little bit all over the place, which makes sense when you have a dictatorship that's repressing a political opposition of any kind. It's not going to be one big, well-organized system. So a couple of pointers to keep in mind. We're going to tell a few different stories about some of the interesting groups, movements, characters, and events. But just to give you a bit of a feel for the overall situation, right from the beginning, the Nazis, of course, are not interested in anybody who opposes what they want to do. This is why they set up concentration camps in the first place. The initial purpose of concentration camps is not, for example, to use Jewish slave labor from Eastern Europe until they die, right? It's for political opponents. So most of the first people who are put in concentration camps in the 30s, the mid 30s, are Germans who are opposed in some way to the Nazi regime. There are many different stripes of people, different kinds of people from different political convictions, different parts of society who oppose the Nazis in different ways. So you can have, for example, some Christian religious opposition, right? Where you might have some priests on the Catholic side or pastors or preachers on the Protestant side who oppose on moral grounds Nazi policies. One of the earliest topics that some churchmen were vocal about was the program to kill people with mental or physical handicaps. This was introduced quite early in the Nazi rule and the church. Some people spoke up against this and suffered some consequences for that. Then you have a big chunk of the opposition that comes from the left side of the political spectrum, whether it's former social democrats, whether it's communists. There was a fairly strong communist party in the Weimar Republic. I think, if memory serves, at some point they were getting close to 20% of the vote at the peak. And of course, there's like street fighting against the Nazis and so on and so forth with communist, organized communists. And they get repressed big time when the Nazis come into power. But quite a lot of these resistance groups have leftist ideas or have connections to the former German Communist Party. And then you have sort of conscientious individuals, people who, well, maybe they have some political opinions that go in a certain direction, but they're not really organized. They're not really political people first. They're just ethically think that this is wrong, and they're going to do what they can do as individuals or as couples or what have you. And they're not part of some bigger kind of network of resistance or cells of resistors or what have you. Overall, I do think symbolically they're very important, especially for Germany after the war. Obviously, they've many of them, and we'll talk about some individuals, have been made into kind of heroes, examples. Schools are named after them, streets, all this kind of stuff. But we shouldn't get caught up in the importance of the symbolism. We're not talking about the level of resistance of partisans in the Soviet Union. We're not talking about the level of resistance of partisans in Yugoslavia. The vast majority of Germans, of course, do not actively resist. This is a part of the nature of the political system, but also ideas about community and nationalism and betrayal and so on and so forth. So that's kind of my little setting of the table. I'm sure there's a couple of things I left out. So let's turn it over to the German on the podcast.
Well, what else can I say? You're absolutely right. I mean, you have lots of different factions, and as you said, we go through them one by one in a minute. But I think you cannot overestimate the importance of all these different groups for modern Germany today. And when you go to one of these attempts, and again, we look at this in much more detail. So it's the famous one, probably the most famous one, the 20th of July putsch, where they try, of course, to blow up Hitler. One of the generals, Tresco, he says, you know what, it doesn't really matter what happens here. The most important thing is to show the world that there's a different Germany. And that's so we must go ahead, we must try to kill Hitler, whether we kill him or not is completely irrelevant. And this, of course, is in the modern day context of Germany. This is really, really important story. And this is why you have all these streets, all these schools, and what have you named after these people, which, by the way, was very, very different all the way up to the 1960s. So you still had the old elites, and most of these, or quite a few of these, saw this very, very differently, regardless of whether these assassins, if that's the right word, came from the left spectrum or the church or what have you, or even the military. There was a very, very different view. Quite often they were seen as traitors first. Because yes, you might say there's something wrong in this country and Nazism and it's all evil, it's all bad. However, so the argument ran, this is still a country at war. If you're going to step the state in the back, we talked about the step in the back with the First World War in a different episode. And this was the idea here as well. So isn't it more important that you defeat the external enemy before you then defeat the internal one? So you can see all sorts of interesting issues and tensions also within a country. That's completely changed. That's completely gone. And now, of course, all these people who try to rid the world of Hitler and the Nazi regime are seen as the great heroes. So that's really, really something important to the national psyche, you might say. So maybe that's enough for the context, I guess. Say, Jesse, hit us with perhaps the first group or individual or people we need to talk through.
Right. I'll start with a very quick anecdote that's related to the point that you made about the importance of them for today. I remember I made friends with a German couple who had moved to Ottawa temporarily when I lived there. And once we got to know each other a little bit, back then I didn't really speak fluent German a bit, and we practiced and they helped me. And of course, I said, yeah, I'm super interested in military history and World War II. And they were a bit, oh, that's interesting. So they weren't too keen, obviously, to talk about that sort of thing. But, we got to know each other and it all worked out in the end. We had a great time hanging out for the year that they lived there. And before they moved back to Germany, they gave me a gift. And the gift that they gave me was a biography of Stauffenberg.
There we go.
So they, in their own way, wanted to make sure that, yeah, okay, this guy is interested in the war and he knows about Nazi Germany and stuff, but we're going to give him this on this particular topic, on this guy who was against Hitler, or at least who ended up being against Hitler. So that I thought was quite interesting. I still have the book, by the way. So, right, the first guy I want to talk about is one of these individuals. It doesn't fit with, he wasn't working with some kind of communist network or whatever. A guy by the name of Georg Elser. And he doesn't get talked about that much. There's an interesting memorial to him in Berlin, where I happen to be sitting right now. There's an interesting memorial to him down in the center of town, not that far where the Reichschancellery was. He tried to assassinate Hitler in November 1939 already. So you can imagine what would have changed if he had succeeded. But essentially, he was convinced that, as far as I recall, he had associations with the Social Democratic Party, who, of course, opposed Hitler before Hitler took power. And he's convinced that, Hitler has started this war, is responsible for the war, and is going to lead Germany to destruction. Most people didn't think that in November 1939 because things had gone well in the war up until then. So what he does, Elsa, is he decides he's going to assassinate Hitler when Hitler goes to visit the very famous brewery in Munich, where he tried to take control of the country in 1923 by a coup, a putsch, the beer hall putsch, right? And he would visit it on the anniversary. So Elsa knew that Hitler's going to come. He's going to visit it, for the old boys and all this kind of stuff who were with him back then in November. And so he managed to plant a bomb inside the brewery. You can like Wikipedia it if you really want to know the intricate details of how he kind of set this up. But anyway, he planted a bomb inside the brewery and it was timed to go off when Hitler would be there. But of course, there's a change of plan and Hitler doesn't stay as long or what have you. And when the bomb explodes, Hitler's not there. And I think a waitress, poor woman, a waitress was killed. But anyway, to make a long story short, Elsa attempted this assassination of Hitler very early on before many other people turned against Hitler. And I think that's one of the things that makes his case quite interesting. He's not as famous, obviously, as the generals and officers who were involved in 1944. But, he's much, much earlier. And I think that speaks to some of his, the strength of his convictions. He was, of course, as is going to be the ending for nearly all of these stories, he was executed later on. So Elsa is quite an interesting case. Very, very early, very determined, and nearly succeeded in assassinating Hitler.
He's still a pretty big name in Germany, I have to say, but I know internationally probably not, because I think Stauffenberg, and we'll talk about Stauffenberg in a minute, and the military plot or plots, we need to say, because there's more than one, overshadow everything. But in Germany, it's still a relatively famous name. There's also a film, I think, from the 1970s called Georg Elser, which some people watch, some people don't, but it's still a name, at least in Germany, that's known. As you already said, fascinating. So it's one of the. It really depends on how you count these things and what you see as an assassination attempt. Some people have counted up to 42 assassination attempts on Hitler, and of course survives them all. And so this is where he says, well, destiny has chosen him, and the usual kind of stuff that you hear. And one of the first times that Hitler talks about this is after this particular attempt to kill him here. Yes, the bomb goes off. So basically, Elsa goes to the Bürgerbräu Keller. So it's the cellar. He then stays in the toilet, the loo, gets locked up, walks around for a few days, sees, okay, I can come back here, then does that for a relatively long period of time, plants the bomb, time mechanism. And as you say, it goes off exactly when it's supposed to go off, but Hitler isn't there anymore because Hitler just came down from Berlin. The war is going on now, so he needs to be back in Berlin, but he has to come to Munich. You already explained why. It's really the big thing for the Nazis and the Nazi party. And he's supposed to stay for several hours, as always, because Hitler is not known for giving short speeches. But that evening, there's a bit of a problem because he was supposed to fly back from Munich to Berlin. He can't do that because it's November, so it's bad weather in Berlin, so there is fog, so the plane can't take off, so he can't fly, so he has to take the night train. So he has to leave early. And as you say, that's why after only a few minutes of his speech, he then says, okay, well, party comrades, that's the term we would have used. We're done. I'm back to Berlin to win the war for all of us. And everyone cheers, he's off. And then, a few minutes later, the bomb explodes. So it's actually quite fascinating. And as I said, the repercussions of this and also the influence this has on Hitler himself and also the Nazi party. So destiny has chosen this man. No one can kill him. He can't be touched. There's a higher destiny, the salvation and what have you, and grandeur of Germany, the usual kind of stuff. But it is really interesting. And then Elsa tries to get away. He's actually captured while he's trying to get across the border into Switzerland. Behaves in a slightly kind of too obvious fashion and way. He wasn't particularly savvy. He wasn't particularly, in inverted commas, clever. He was very good at what he did with the bomb, but apart from that, not really. Relatively quickly, they put two and two together, and then he's put in the concentration camp, stays there till early April 1945, when Hitler then decides to have, for a better term, a bit of a clear out of concentration camps, and lots of people that had been involved in some of these plots in April, all the way up to early May 1945, then get assassinated. So very, very, all the way up to the end of the war. So really quite nasty when you think about that. But an absolutely fascinating character. And yes, an individual who very, very nearly succeeded. So it's quite striking.
I have to say, I don't know. It's so hard for people to engage in individual acts of resistance, like sociologically, right? You're going against everybody around you. You're taking a huge risk. Even if in your own thoughts, you think, this is not right what's happening. I'm against what's happening. I wish it weren't happening. I would join a group if there were a group. But to go ahead and do something so, well, frankly, extreme by the standards of the circumstances, you have to be different and maybe a little unusual as well at the same time. I want to talk about someone else on my list before as we move on. Let's say I do want to talk about someone who was probably a part of one of these small groups. So you have several small groups of people who are like-minded. Often they're based on a couple of married couples, for example, that work together. Most often, they've had some kind of leftist political sympathies, sometimes communist, sometimes social democratic. And there was one group called the Boise Harnack group, also probably better known by their sort of nickname, I guess, which is the Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra. And they distributed literature secretly to try to recruit other sort of, other intellectually minded, educated people who might oppose what they saw as, Nazi barbarism, and perhaps who also felt left-wing sympathies. They were sympathetic to the Soviet Union in its relationship with Nazi Germany. And one of the women who was kind of associated with this group was a dancer and a sculptor by the name of Oda Schottmüller. And she had a studio in Berlin. And according to the Nazi authorities, she allowed some members of this Red Orchestra group to use an illegal radio to try to warn the Soviets in 1941 that Germany had plans to invade them. So you can imagine there's like a sculptor's studio. This woman, people Google Oda Schottmüller if you can, because she was a dancer in all sorts of like crazy costumes, like a sort of interpretive dancer, totally alternative, whatever. Although she did dance for the Wehrmacht in the early part of the war as well. But it's an open question as to, was she really motivated or did she just need some cash? In any case, supposedly these communist sympathetic resistors are trying to warn the Soviets by radio from her studio. She did distribute their flyers, people that she knew, but then this group got cracked by the Gestapo and they all got arrested in 1942, including Oda, and she got chucked in jail with the others. And she denied this. She's like, no, I wasn't a part of this resistance group, et cetera, et cetera. Now, she had become a bit known because she started giving private artistic dance performances for people. And, like in any dictatorship, this was the case in the Soviet Union, a lot of the art, if you want to criticize, and not directly though, because that's dangerous, you can kind of try to do it through art. So there's all sorts of like weird artistic Soviet movies that are kind of a metaphor for indirectly criticizing the Soviet system. And she was apparently doing that, trying to do that through her dancing, to sort of give messages of criticizing the Nazis. There is an audience for that, I suppose. Probably not going to be me. But in any case, she gets chucked in jail in 1942, and she's able to smuggle a few notes out to a fellow inmate at this woman's prison. Eventually, of course, she gets sentenced to death, and she then gets executed in 1943, I think in fall or late summer 1943. So she's kind of an interesting case. She sort of shows that she's actively against the Nazis, but then also denies the main accusation against her. So it's a bit of one of these gray areas. And I think that's important when we're talking about this topic, because there are a lot of gray areas or people who kind of do two different things in contradiction. In any case, for Oda Schottmüller, I just wanted to also read you an extract from her last letter that was smuggled out of prison. She wrote it to her mother. And it's touching, right? It pulls at the heartstrings. So here it goes. This is a letter from Oda Schottmüller, convicted of resistance against Nazi Germany, to her mother on the 5th of August in 1943. So, my dear little mother, she has a nickname for her. We didn't get to see each other again after all, and I must bid you farewell in this way. Be brave. Think about how you will live through good time. You were always by my side these last years and helped me achieve so much through your loyal help that it's nearly impossible to say thank you. But you know best yourself and will always remember what I achieved artistically in the difficult transition years. Not exactly sure what she means by transition years, maybe her own relationship with her mother, was only possible with the support I got from you. That everything is over now suits my ways. I never wanted to get old. Slowly fossilizing is certainly not pretty. The last months were certainly very difficult for me, especially being cut off from my work. Became ever more unbearable, but I've gotten through it. Much remains unsaid between us, perhaps the most important thing, but it's better that way. Feel hugged and kissed, my dear mummy, from your Oda. And those are the last known words of this woman who was executed for resistance. And I think they're very poignant. It's not a political diatribe. It's a very personal thing between a woman and her mother, and sort of trying to make sense of what she knows is going to happen on a personal level. And I kind of, that's why I chose that extract, because in this kind of situation, it's as much about the personal history as it is about the political history of it all. So there was sculptor and probable resistor Oda Schottmüller.
Again, a fascinating group. It's one of the larger groups as well. When you look at all the people that are involved, so the Gestapo later on, well, has a list of up to, I think it's 400 people. So by the standards of the day, by the standards of a sort of conspiracy organization, this is quite big, quite large. So they managed to operate for quite some time, actually. It's interesting. And this, I would say, is probably one of these organizations that is not particularly well remembered anymore in Germany. And I think there's a reason for that. And again, it's all to do with politics, isn't it? Because, well, it's in the name, isn't it? It's Red Orchestra. So you immediately have the links to communism, Bolshevism, whatever you want to call it, the Soviet Union, all these things, which of course meant that during the days of the German partition in the GDR, so this group, these individuals were seen as in many ways, the most important members of the resistance because they were, in inverted commas, fighting for the right sort of cause. So that makes sense, of course, from a political, ideological point of view during the Cold War. And now, I would say, unless you really are an expert and you're really interested in the resistance that happened in Germany, not a lot of people, at least in the West, older people in East Germany, former Eastern Germany, probably still remember them because that was what you were being taught and it was talked about. In the rest of the country, probably not so much because, in inverted commas, they had the wrong political ideas. But it's interesting to see that it still took the German parliament, I think, up to 2009 to overturn the judgments of the National Socialist judiciary for treason of all these people and to rehabilitate them. So that's also interesting. It takes quite some time. Generally speaking, I'm always slightly skeptical when you just lift all of these cases and you try to overturn what was said in the old days. You have to be careful. I always say you have to do it by a one-by-one case. I'm skeptical when you just lift everything so that we overturn everything and everyone's now written off, because sometimes, I'm not saying it happened in this organization now, probably did, but other organizations as well, it's just a general comment, that quite often, well, not quite often, but sometimes people, even within these groups, were put on trial for other and just reasons, and just basically lifting all of this, completely overturn it. I don't think that's the right way either. So you have to do it by case study. But here, of course, you can see that of these 400, the very large majority were put on trial for treason because they were working against the Nazi state. So of course you can say, okay, by 2009 standards, that makes sense. So there we are. So, but again, it's an interesting debate, interesting thing to look at, say, because quite often all these stories, particularly when you look at the resistance, it's not quite often not really about what this group did during the time of the Nazi period, but it's how they are then being remembered, also sometimes utilized, perhaps even abused through the political systems that come after 1945 in whatever shape or form. So that in itself is a really interesting aspect. And again, we could talk about all this for hours, how all this changes and shifts in both Germany's, outside of Germany and other countries, and also over time. Very, very interesting indeed.
All right. Do you want to take us down another road of another kind of resistance?
Well, if we stay within these civilian groups, perhaps very, very briefly, the Weiße Rose, the White Rose group. I'm sure you know quite a bit about them as well. I just want to throw them in here because they kind of sit somewhere in a similar area to what we've already discussed. Because what you have now is a group of very, very young students, 18, 19, 20 years old, who in Munich start to work against the regime. But basically, by starting to work against the regime, most of the time, they're not really doing anything bad, you might say. They're doing something that in a modern Western society would be perfectly normal to do. And that means mainly they print leaflets. And they hand these leaflets out, for example, in the Munich University. And while they're doing that, Scholl is her name. She's caught by the caretaker. She's arrested. She's put on trial. And she's executed because she's putting out leaflets which speak out against the Nazi regime, the Nazi terror, the war, and all these things. I mean, that in itself, again, just shows you quite a bit about the oppression that you find in a system like this. something that we think these days is perfectly normal. Whether you're against something or for something, you just put a leaflet out, and that's perfectly okay. In those days, that was enough to get you executed. So it's her, it's a brother, and it's also a friend. And these guys are super famous in Germany, again, because they were young, so they're university students. So they have a slightly different feel than, for example, the Red Orchestra we just talked about. No one really talks about them, perhaps also because that group is too big. Here you've got practically 3 individuals. I mean, some others are involved as well, but these are the famous ones. So the siblings Scholl and then her friend.
And their memory is not only important because it works well, right? They're sort of innocent young people. So you can say they don't have, communist associations with the Soviet Union, et cetera, or they weren't like military officers who fought for Hitler until he was losing, then turned against him. They're kind of a tabula rasa, a blank slate. You can say they were good, which of course they actually probably were, which is one of the reasons why they're so prominent. But their memory, it's interesting how it can still come up sometimes. There was a project on Instagram, I think it was last year or 2 or 3 years ago, where a group created an account, not a group of private people, but it was an educational thing, created an account as though there was this Instagram account for Sophie Scholl. And there would be an actress saying, I'm Sophie Scholl, and this is what I'm doing today. And to try to reach, young people. And this was a bit controversial because you're the young woman risked her life and was then executed. And here you have her talking about what she's wearing on Instagram in order to try to reach young people. But at the same time, the criticism, which I think I partly agree with, is that you're completely, watering down what happened to her and what her fate was and what her decision was, So that was quite an interesting one. And I'm not going to give away specifics here, but there was another infamous incident a few years ago where a young German woman compared what she felt. She was supporting a particular political cause amongst today's German parties, and she got some criticism for that. And she said in public, speaking on a stage, I am like Sophie Scholl, right? I am being oppressed like she was, which of course, it was a very foolish thing to say and then got her a lot more criticism. And hopefully she's managed to see the error of her ways, but also recover from the public mistake that she made. That's also not easy. But yes, you can see right away, this ignites a firestorm. This memory can still be one that gets ripped away from its historical meaning sometimes for other purposes. So White Rose Group, lots of movies, lots of, yeah.
Again, is it interesting that when you look at the groups we've looked at so far, and also the individual, Elsa, for example, so he tries to kill Hitler, whereas this group here, the White Rose, Hans and Sophie Scholl, and the 3 friends that they've got, but basically all they do is print leaflets and distribute them. And that's good enough, first of all, to get you imprisoned, secondly, to get you executed, and also to be put into this pool, quite rightly so, because they get executed, of resistance. Let's call them resistance fighters, because as I said, well, today that would just be a very normal thing to do, and it's a just very different time when you think about it. So quite drastic, I think is probably the word.
No question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are other groups. There are also more individuals. We could talk again about each of these groups for hours and hours and hours. But considering also that we're supposed to be talking a little bit about the military side of things and war, because that's what the podcast is all about, maybe we now switch our attention and go to the military resistance to Hitler and to Nazism, because that's, again, is a very big field, and we need some time to get to the bottom of the whole thing here. So where do we start with this? I mean, do we go all the way back to 1933? Because that's already where you might say the resistance starts. You've got the first resistance group, so to speak, against Hitler. the then head of the German army, a chap called Hammerstein Eckert, he is very anti-Nazi, and he's already kind of creating some circuits here to work against the Nazis. There's no talk of coup yet because it's 1933. It's too early for this because you're not quite sure yet where Nazism will go. No one knows that while you're looking at the Second World War, these things. But you can see there is an anti-Nazi movement sentiment, you might say, within the senior military circles. And I think we need to understand what the military really is, because quite often, particularly when you watch the wrong sort of movies, you always get the feel that all these Wehrmacht officers were basically like they're super Nazis. They're all like SS guys. They're completely indoctrinated. No, they're not. So the traditional military elite in Germany is just like the traditional elite in pretty much every other country, and that is conservative. So when you go to the top ranks of the army, they all have a von in front of their name. And that, of course, means they're a member of the aristocracy. You think this through now, and think about 1933. So you come from good old, let's say, Prussian or whatever stock. You can trace your family line back several hundred years to whatever. Your family members have always served as officers in the Prussian, Bavarian, what have you army. And suddenly these, you might even say thugs of the Third Reich coming on, because that's the whole idea, isn't it? That there's National Socialism. It's in the word, isn't it? It's socialism. You don't want anything to do with socialists, even though they're national, but this is completely wrong. This is the riffraff. So keep away from them. And this is what you get amongst the old military. It then changes, particularly as the war goes on, and Hitler and the Nazi regime have a very, very clear policy to drive out the old elites and get new people in who are only just subscribing to the Nazi ideology. But in the early days, that's very, very different. So there's a lot of antipathy, a lot of kind of distrust and dislike towards the Nazis. It really comes out, you might say, the first time in this context, within this context of trying to overthrow Hitler, really in 1938. In 1938, the military is planning a coup to overthrow Hitler. Not a lot of people know this because most people always look at 1944, but the first time this happens is in 1938. Because the military leadership get together, for example, Ludwig Beck, who's the chief of general staff, Hans Oster, he is a man who works in intelligence, very important because he gives information to the Western Allies about the German war plans in 1939 as well. They get together and they say, we need to do something here because Hitler is going to push Germany, well, basically over the edge into the abyss, and that's not good. Interestingly enough, they say this not necessarily because they're 100% against Hitler, against the foreign policy ideas that he has, getting those territories back in the East, all against the Treaty of Versailles, but because they think he's doing it too early. That's quite interesting, actually. So you can see there's a little bit of that as well. So it's a bit of a gray zone here. But they do say in 1938, when you have the problem or the question, the debates about Czechoslovakia and Sudetenland, if that had led to war, they had made plans to overthrow Hitler, throw him in jail, put him on trial, and basically, if war breaks out, try to make peace immediately. And in many ways, you might say this really is the tragedy of the Munich Agreement of 1938. Chamberlain going to Munich, and they then basically get the Sudetenland and all these stories that we have. Because if that had worked out differently, you might say perhaps that would have been the end of Hitler. Because for pure military reasons, the military were willing to act. Again, just to stress this point, not only because they were against Hitler, because they thought, he's voted in, he's the Führer, so okay, that's fine, but because they thought he was acting too early and militarily they weren't ready. I think that's quite fascinating when you look at this. Jesse, do you have any other ideas about military leaders, military conspiracy and all these things?
Well, I mean, there was a culture clash, right? As you said, between the mostly Prussian, but not exclusively, of course, but this Junker class of aristocrats who families served in the army for whatever generations, like von Moltke, right? You have the elder, the younger. That's not an exception. And then you have this new revolutionary sort of government that in some ways has some meritocratic ideas about who should be in charge in the military or who can get promoted or who can become a general. So you have people from backgrounds that are not seen very well amongst the aristocrats all of a sudden being their equals in terms of rank. And that, some people are not too happy with that. As far as 1938 is concerned, now I'm out of my element here. I'm relying on you, Matthias, to guide us through this topic. But was there not an attempt to put a bomb on Hitler's plane at some point in this late 30s period that it also would have worked but didn't go off or something? I'm not making this up, am I?
No, no, you're not making this up. You're just getting the year wrong.
Okay.
So that happens in 1943.
Okay.
But there is a plan. So what happens there is that Tresco and all these people that then become famous in the 1944 plot, they try to blow up Hitler. Not the first time they're trying to do this. So at that particular stage, Hitler flies to Vinnytsia, which is in modern day, it's Ukraine, isn't it? To look at the headquarters. Then on the way back, they put a bomb on his plane, hoping that it would explode and just blow him up and kill him. That doesn't happen. The bomb doesn't go off. No one's really quite sure why. Some people have said it's because of the air pressure. It's because it's quite cold up in there. So simple thing is it doesn't go off. Hitler survives. This is not the only time that someone tries to blow up Hitler. There's another incident, another example, and this is slightly earlier. And Hitler goes to an exhibition in central Berlin, and what is today the Museum of German History, Unter den Linden, the main street. And there's an exhibition, and in this they show all the captured Soviet war material. And that's a great thing because it's important because it looks as if they're winning the war and what have you. And slightly similar to what happened in 1938 when he just gave this quick speech and then disappeared. He just rushes through. He's not interested, which is very, very unlike Hitler because you think he'd spend lots of time looking at the equipment. He had an eye for detail. He was very, very good at technical detail. Everyone says this. Everyone expected he would be there a long, long time. But after a few minutes, he's had enough. And that puts his military adjutant into a bit of a difficult position, a bit of a pickle here, because this guy...
He was loaded.
He was loaded. He was willing to blow himself up. So he takes hand grenades with timed fuses, activates them, puts them into his pocket, and makes sure he stands next to Hitler. So Hitler then walks off, and he then rushes to the loo and trying to defuse these hand grenades. That's quite an interesting one. Again, coming back to these, what we said, up to 42 attempts, depending on how you look at them and how you count them, where Hitler just got away with it. And what I also find really interesting when you look at this particular incident is probably the first and only time that someone was trying or willing to sacrifice himself in order to kill Hitler, because all the other ones, that doesn't happen. And I personally, and perhaps now it's time to move on to the famous and the big one, and the Stauffenberg plot. You can say an awful lot about what happened in 1944, the 20th of July. And the simple fact that no one had the guts. These are all very, very experienced military officers, staff officers with iron crosses, knight's crosses, seen lots of frontline action, that no one's willing to just take the pistol and shoot him. Also, it's only just the beginning of the story of the military resistance to Hitler and all these plots trying to kill him. So hand grenades and bombs. There is, of course, the very, very famous one, the most famous one that everybody remembers, not least because everyone has seen Tom Cruise in Valkyrie. He actually, by the way, looks like Stauffenberg, which is slightly scary. His German isn't all that great, but that's a different story. And that, of course, is the Stauffenberg plot, the 20th of July, 1944 plot trying to kill Hitler, which really is the outstanding one, the one that everybody knows. This is a very, very long story. We do need some time to get into it, to set the scene, to provide the context, to analyze it, because there's a lot there. So, Jesse, maybe we leave that one for another episode, because otherwise this now is going to be a mega episode. Once you get me started on Stauffenberg, I will not shut up. So maybe we park this, and dear listeners and viewers, we'll revisit this in a different episode. So moving away perhaps from the military again, before I get tempted to just ramble on, Jesse, do we have any other people that we want to mention here in this particular episode?
Yes, there were. Stauffenberg is definitely, well, the July 20th plot, and let's not just limit it to him, of course, despite Tom Cruise and all of that. It's worth its own episode. So For today, though, I had a couple of other cases of resistance that I thought were interesting enough, at least for a mention, for listeners out there to Google them and Wikipedia them, not to chat GPT them necessarily because of the danger of hallucinations, but I digress. So, one of the instances of a kind of resistance that I thought was quite interesting, because in this case, it was public and it was successful in what it was trying to achieve, were these protests in 1943 in a street in Berlin called the Rosenstraße. And what happened there was, of course, German Jews were being deported to the ghettos and concentration camps and death camps eventually in the East. But the fact that some German Jews were married to German Christians created a difficulty for the government. What are you going to do about these people, right? They have a legal status where they're connected to what the government sees as the right kind of citizen, the only kind of citizen who should have any rights, and so on. But there's that legal status, and then there's that personal relationship. So there are a bunch of male German Jews who are arrested and are slated for deportation. And lo and behold, their wives, who were not communists, who were not super anti-Hitler necessarily, saying, "Oh, we oppose on ethical grounds the whole regime." No, they didn't want to lose their husband. And so you have these German Christian women who protest together in this street for several days. I think it lasts a week, actually, 1943. And it kind of works because the government then doesn't deport their husband. So, as far as I know, it's kind of the only group or mass. It's not, I mean, we're not talking thousands of people here. The only sort of group public demonstration against the Nazis by Germans during the war. And it's kind of interesting that it was based on those personal connections and how that social fabric could still exist. There's obviously a lot of literature and a lot of accounts of German Christian neighbors turning in or taking advantage of their Jewish neighbors or taking their property once they've been turned in or deported and so on. There's a lot of emphasis on how the social fabric breaks down and in these cases. And it's quite interesting to see a case where between married couples, in this case, it held. And they made a courageous decision to do that, and it kind of worked. So that was one pretty interesting instance. Another one is another individual woman, and I'll be shorter than I was for the Schottmüller example, but there was a Czech Polish actress by the name of Marianne Goldlust. She also married a German, Hans Goldlust, a German Jew. And they lived together in Germany for a long time in the 20s and in Austria. And then they were living in Prague when the war breaks out. And her husband leaves, I guess, just before the war breaks out. Her husband leaves because obviously, the writing is on the wall for Jews in particular. Many of them left. She stays, though, and she gets involved in a resistance group. Some of them are trying to get refugees out. Some of them hide Jews in their apartments and homes. She was also involved in getting information about the situation in the former Czechoslovakia to the Czech government in exile in London. So a purely political purpose as well. Unfortunately, she gets captured and arrested in 1942. And what she does then is also interesting. She confesses. So not like Schottmüller, who denied. Goldlust, she confessed. She's like, "Yep, I'm a resistance person. I was a main person in this network. And those other people you arrested with me, I don't know them. They weren't in the group, even though they were." And so she kind of took the hit for them, and at least some of them were released. And she then, in 1943, was guillotined, as was the standard practice. But she's one of those people who, after the war, was recognized by Yad Vashem, the big Holocaust memorial and museum in Israel, as one of the so-called righteous among the nations. So people who tried to help the Jews. So her story is quite an interesting one. She also smuggled a bunch of her last letters out of jail and they've been published. I think there's an English translation as well. And finally, there's a group, and this was a question from one of our supporters as well. My apologies, I didn't write down the name, but you know who you are. This person asked about the Edelweiss Pirates. And the Edelweiss Pirates, I'll keep it quick here in case, folks, to give you some food for thought for your own reading. The Edelweiss Pirates are interesting. They are active starting from the 1930s, so quite a bit before the war. They're a group of young people. They're a group of teenagers, mostly in the towns, some towns in West Germany, although there were a couple of similar groups, like in Leipzig, there was a group. They're not super organized, but they're basically informal groups of kids who rebel against the authoritarian aspect. I mean, kids usually rebel against authority in some way. And in this case, they were really not fans of the Hitler Youth, which became obligatory for teenagers. So, what some of these kids did is to avoid being forced to go into the Hitler Youth, which was seen as dictatorial and conformist. They would drop out of high school, so then they could kind of escape eligibility, if you will. They were big on nature stuff. They would go for camping together and sing-alongs and hiking as a part of their kind of esprit de corps, which the Hitler Youth also did, interestingly enough, and the young communist Komsomol also did, and so on and so forth. And they would pick street fights with Hitler Youth groups when they could, when they thought, I guess, that they had a chance. And one of their mottos was eternal war on the Hitler Youth. So this was really their focal point, was we're the opposite of the Hitler Youth type of rebellion. Some of them later joined resistance groups during the war when they were a little bit older. Several of them were prominent in a group called the Edelfelder Gruppe in 1944. And then it was discovered, and several of the members who were hanged to death were former Edelweiss pirates. Interestingly, they were also anti-communist, so they weren't kind of didn't have any kind of communist association at the time. So those were a few words about the Edelweiss pirates. Look them up. They are kind of interesting that kids would take that sort of initiative in that way. Any comment on the Edelweiss Pirates, Matthias? Are they your old running
not on the
mates,
Edelweiss
or?
Pirates? I think you've said everything, but I think that's enough. The Rosenstraße event that you mentioned, again, it's become very famous. There is a very big monument in Berlin, and you explained everything that happened. What's really interesting when you look at the laws at that particular time, so these people that were locked up and seemingly about to be deported, according to the laws of the Nazi state, were never going to be deported in the first place. So the fact that all these women turn up and do exactly as you say is, you might say, a public relations disaster for the Nazi Party. But when you look at the actual rules and laws, the Nuremberg laws and all these things that are applied, these guys would have been released anyway. So technically, I was just busting a myth again, the women don't really achieve anything because they probably would have been released. However, there is, of course, the effect, the signal that this sends out to not only Germany, the wider world. And this is also why we now have this big monument there. And this is why people remember this particular story.
Right. In that case, folks, we've gone on a whistle-stop tour of all sorts of different aspects and groups and individuals of German resistance before and during the Second World War. Naturally, we left out the most famous instance of the July 20th plot, but never fear, we shall return, to quote MacArthur, we shall return to that topic in a future episode. So thanks for listening. If you want to submit a question to us, if you want to support the podcast, head on over to bothsidesofthewire.com. We have exclusive content there that you won't find on the usual platforms. It's in our war room, and you can try that out for free for a month by using the code DeepDarkWoods. So that was it for today's episode on German resistance, and we'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to World War II Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Well, now I feel like going out and resisting something, I guess. I don't know.
You'll find something.
There's always something.